Hey everybody, it's Philosophy Friday! All right. Got some feedback that some people were missing that intro, so I brought it back for the moment. Welcome everybody. Your regular hosts are back. We're back on the attack as usual. Myself, Joseph Kim, CEO of Leela Games, and Brett Novak, CEO of leading market research firm for the video games industry, Liquid and Grit. And today we are going to discuss a topic sometimes of high controversy and debate. To be honest, it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on this, Brett. I'm not sure where you stand on some of this debate. So let's see. However, the general focus of our discussion today will be about what are the skills and kind of personality required to be a winning product manager. And generally speaking, I would say like the debate is generally one that depends on your organizational legacy, like the kind of organization that you come from generally kind of dictates your orientation, but we can go into that in a little bit. I personally believe that PMs need a number of skills, quantitative and logic and problem-solving skills, ability to do specific types of analysis. But the debate part often comes when I often argue that it's actually not necessarily the skills that are as difficult to learn, but more around personality or specific personality traits that, at least in my experience, in some cases are sometimes impossible for certain types of people to develop. And so we can talk about that, but in what I generally look for are something that I call a needle moving PM, a PM who can actually make a big impact on a product. And I think for that, it just really requires a certain kind of personality or personality trait. So just to outline the discussion for today, and I know we've talked about this before in other podcasts, but I do think it bears repeating some of the organizational differences that we see in the gaming industry, ways in which some organizations are structured differently and therefore would dictate what types of skills and personality would enable you to be more successful in those kinds of organizations. Second, we'll try to have a general discussion about the general kinds of skills PMs should have in order to be effective. Third, we'll then talk about personality, the specific traits. Again, I'm sure there's a lot of schools of thoughts on this, but Brett and I can talk about some of our thoughts. And finally, just for fun, we can talk and potentially argue about what is most critical for PMs to be able to win, be effective in terms of the prioritization of whether it's skills or personality or specific skills or specific personality traits. But before jumping in, Brett, any thoughts on that? What are your high-level thoughts before we jump in?
Probably my biggest high-level thought is when I started Liquid and Grit, one of the things I learned pretty quickly was that finding personality traits was much more important than finding skills, because it was very easy to teach skills and very difficult to change personalities. So we basically changed our entire hiring process to focus on characteristics or personality traits over skills so that we could optimize for that. So I think it's pretty critical. And I also don't believe that if the average of belief that is here with your ability to change someone's personalities and characteristics is here, my level is like down here. So another philosophy I have is like, what you hire is what you get. And there are some exceptions to that rule. I know there's one or two that people are that's gonna pop in their mind, but they're so rare. It's generally what you hire is what you get. That's kind of my philosophy.
Yeah, I agree with you on. So I guess we do both agree that personality is harder. I actually at the high level agree that personality is very difficult, sometimes if not impossible to change. But maybe I'm a little bit more optimistic in the ability for changes to occur just based upon some of my own experience. But I do agree it's super tough, super tough. But okay, so maybe we could start with organizational differences. And when I think about different kinds of gaming studios and how they're organized and how the PM function is different, kind of like I think about it in a few different ways. The first is generally this notion of small versus big, meaning the size of the team. And usually the bigger the team usually correlates to greater specialization, right? So you don't just have like your like engineer, you have your uh, physics engineer, your tools engineer, your engine engineer. There's like all this specialization, and that can also um, you can also have that level of specialization on the PM side. We've talked about this before, whether you have your revenue PM, growth PM, Fatui PM, you're this PM, you're that PM, and things like that, versus being kind of broader or more full stack. And my general sense is that kind of examples of different kinds of organizations in terms of how full stack they are versus specialized is, for example, if you're going to a company making like a bigger high production game, you usually have the bigger team. So companies like EA or Zynga would probably shift more towards the higher specialization, the bigger teams. Supercell would be an example of a smaller, more compact, more full stack team. But that's one area of difference when it comes to PMs organizationally. The second has to do with how close PMs are to product. And generally speaking, the difference I usually see is kind of, I would say, three levels. One is like, well, I would say that the main difference would be a PM that's more focused on planning, and then having a PM that's not only doing planning, but also involved in production, meaning the development. Like the PM may be leading engineering sprints, might be the product owner or scrum master or whatever. And so there isn't a layer between them and engineering, which you might see at a company, let's say at Zynga, where there could be a producer that sits in between engineering and the planning function, for example. And so PM, and correct me if I'm wrong, Brett, at Zynga might own the product roadmap, might own the prioritization and coming up with what features to be worked on and the backlog and priority, but it may be up to a producer to actually work directly with engineering, follow through on those features and things like that. So small versus big, planning versus execution. The third level that I speak about is like sometimes, and especially from like, I would say HD console type of companies, a PM might actually not even be involved in planning, but more focused on analysis and kind of, basically in some cases being like a SQL monkey, just doing SQL queries and things like that. So there's that part. There's also the third part is technical orientation or not. And this generally depends on the legacy of or the kind of company that you're coming from. There's certain companies that just have a higher technical orientation, especially certain, I would say, like tech companies like Microsoft, Facebook, or Google. You might have a lot of PMs that are like former engineers and things like that. And so the degree to which you have to be technically oriented could be different or not. And then I know, Brett, you left me a note not to forget about 0 to 1, but yes, 0 to 1, whether you're working on a new game or not, whether you're doing live ops or not. So these are some of the organizational differences, which would then dictate, depending on the scope of what you're working on, what skills and what kind of personality traits are going to be important for you to be successful. And Brett, just kind of talking through that, do you have any other thoughts? Would you agree or disagree, or have other ways in which you would differentiate PMs organizationally?
Well, first, I just want to say that it's good that we got 0 to 1 out, because I don't think we've gone a whole podcast without you saying it. So I just want to keep that streak alive.
What's funny is like okay, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I was about to say like, I've written a lot about the, applying the Peter Thiel 0 to 1 concept to game development, but it's kind of funny because like, I would meet sometimes like some folks like VCs or whoever who would try to teach me this concept. I'm just like, what, you guys got this? Anyway, go
Yeah.
ahead.
Yeah. um, I mean, the other thing that just came to my mind when you were saying all that is it is pretty interesting how the product management role is not very clearly defined, and it is different wherever you go, and or it can be very
Right.
different wherever you go. So it's I think in gaming it's a little bit more specific. In mobile gaming, I think it's been relatively defined by probably Zynga and maybe probably Zynga in terms of product management. So you have more of a little bit of a template, but even that, right? You talk to people and you get their perspective on what a PM is or does. It definitely changes, even in the same size or the same planning or same org or whatever. It's kind of all over the place.
Right. And so then maybe the second topic we could talk about now are specific skills. And so and maybe we could start with you, Brett. So when you think about the skills that just in the general case, skills that a PM should know, what do you think about? What should these skills be that PMs know?
Well, I'm going to steal some from yours then if I'm going first,
Okay, go
but
for it.
I do
Yeah.
think that bringing a sense of analytics and a perspective of monetization to the team is probably what I would say the number one thing for a product manager, right? And we've talked about this before. To me, a product manager is sort of like a poker player who knows the odds of poker and makes decisions based on what is best on the board, what is best in the hand, and can build models or frameworks or bring numbers and money into the conversation to make more valuable decisions, and valuable being defined by money, right? It's just an unfortunate component of business that we have to be concerned about money. The second is probably clarity of thought. And that is a little bit vague because it can be defined by how the organization does that. In my case, it's generally writing a spec or writing a plan or writing a strategy. It's not necessarily your plan or strategy or spec, but it is the clarification of what the team or your boss or whomever is driving the decisions is trying to have, right? Like, and so that clarity allows for other people in the team to understand it. And those are my top two skills of a product manager. I'm going to stop there.
All right. Yeah, and so I definitely agree. I definitely think that to your point about like clarity of thought, basically, I would kind of describe that as just strong logical thinking, problem solving skills is very important. Um, I also think just having strong quantitative analysis, so like the ability to be able to design and structure very clean, simple, well-formed spreadsheets for various types of analysis. I mean, there's so many models that you have to build as a PM. And so being able to do that well, so understanding, not only all the formulas, but being able to, do pivot tables, do sensitivity analysis, doing all the things that you can in a spreadsheet is very, very important. And so I think there's like maybe if I were to pull back and kind of describe categories. So one, like the problem solving, clarity of thinking, how you structure and think about stuff is one. Quantitative skills in terms of like, and one part is like modeling, Excel, that sort of thing. But in addition, I think having a basic understanding of statistics, I think in some cases, understanding how to do a linear regression, depending on the organization that you're from. In some cases, being able to do things like SQL queries. That's not at our company. That's not as important for a PM, but I know at some companies, being able to do that is important. I think the third part I would say would be understanding the product. So, if at our company we're working on shooters, so I would expect all of our PMs to just really know that space very well, to understand shooters, to be playing shooters. And this is I would say, one of the issues that we often see in some game companies where there's such a focus on, how well can you model, how well can you do things? And then you hire like the MBA or the ex-banker who's strong quantitatively, but then they don't really understand the product because it's kind of beneath them. They're too white collar to then play the shit out of all of the games in the category and really understand the product well and have a sense for the feel of the game, because they just want to focus on the planning and doing all the more quantitative analysis. And then maybe like two other aspects I would say is another one would be tools. So basically understanding how to use the major PM tools that that you would be using. So whether it's a PM tool like Jira, Asana, Trello, ClickUp, Monday, or whatever, and understanding all the differences and things like that. And maybe finally, just uh, kind of, I would call it like strategic thinking or framework based thinking, being able to structure things in clear and easy ways to communicate to different people in the organization. And so coming up with frameworks and ways of thinking about problems in simple ways, I think, is also important.
Yeah, I mean the other two that we haven't talked about and down on my list would be creativity. Yeah, I think that depends on the organization, but I always felt like that was a strength of mine at Zynga. At that size, the product manager was also very involved in the game design aspects of the feature, very involved in critiquing the art that came out, or also just thinking of original ideas and being creative was, I think, for me at least, was a big advantage, right? I mean, some PMs could sort of optimize what was already out there, and other PMs were really thinking about original things. 0 to 1, as I've heard on someone's podcast, I can't remember whose. 0 to 1 thoughts. But
Yeah.
yeah, so that one, and then the other is obviously dependent on the organization. But I mean, I think in all organizations, there's obviously that understanding of humans, right? There's that ability to interact, the ability to lead, depending on your role, the ability to integrate, the ability to be part of a team, to collaborate, all that stuff that goes into the human side of being a product manager. I think that's pretty critical. And the last thing is, before we forget, I do think that a podcast that we should do coming up is on tools, JK, because we just got in a debate
Okay.
at Liquid and Grit about whether or not we want to use a project management tool. And I was pretty opposed to it, and some of my devs were for it. And so I'd love to hash it out on that, because I think we would disagree on a lot of that stuff, because we shy away from those
Okay.
things, or
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
do. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And maybe like one other thing I think is important that I didn't mention, I just thought of right now, is root cause analysis. I do think that a lot of PMs oftentimes are looking at symptoms rather than root cause. So understanding whether it's, 5 whys, or being able to, um, understand how to develop like a hypothesis tree or decision tree of some kind, I think is also useful for PMs to learn. And maybe one other thing is just having like this, like your Batman utility belt of different types of analysis and ways you've approached different problems in the past. So as you gain experience in your career, it's like, oh, I remember how we tackled this problem. We used this specific approach, or we looked at these metrics, or things like that. Like, but being able to build that up over time and having your utility belt of different tools and analysis and things like that, I think is also important. All right. So those are the skills. So if you learned that, then I think you'll be all set on skills. And so maybe
Yeah,
the
maybe
next
so.
thing to talk about would be personality traits. And yeah, I mean, maybe you could start there in terms of personality, Brett.
Yeah, so I'm going to start out with my go-to, which is discipline. I feel like if you're going to be a
Yeah.
great PM, you have to be disciplined. I mean, there's so many, and I think this separates the good from the great. We've talked about this before. The good show up, they respond to Slack, they answer emails, and they go to Scrum, and they go to a bunch of meetings, they go home. The great figure out how they're going to spend at least 2 hours, and it might only 2 hours, 2 hours of deep thought work a day to build specs, write documents, think about strategy, build Excel spreadsheets, do analysis. That's really, I think, what the PM has to do to bring value to the organization, and so I think that's discipline. The second is probably humility. I think because if you don't have humility, you're not going to listen to your teammates. You're not going to question the numbers. You're not going to question your ideas. You're not going to be open minded. So I think there needs to be a level of humility. Um, that said, I think you also kind of have to have a level of confidence to go on a limb, because there's just going to be those things that you don't know about, and sort of like be okay with kind of taking a guess at stuff. And then the last one I want to bring up is, well, I guess I said creative before, but the other one is a willingness to learn, because I feel like being a PM is kind of an interesting role in that most organizations, I know if you get super huge, it's specialized, but even when it's super huge, I think you're sort of a jack of all trades. And to be a jack of all trades, you have to be pretty willing to learn, right? So if it's something new happens, right? Play to earn becomes big, or external payments is now a big thing, or something happens in the market. If you're not willing to just roll up your sleeves, I guess roll up your sleeves is probably in line with that, and just learn this new thing, you're definitely going to fall behind as a product manager, because whatever we're talking about now in 2 years from now is going to change, right? PMs are going to be, all of a sudden, it's going to be really important for them to be whatever it is, right? And so if you're not constantly evolving and learning, that's definitely going to slow you down in the long run.
Yeah, and maybe like the specific personality trait that you're alluding to is I do notice that at certain organizations there's kind of like a little bit of a laziness where it's just like, okay, well, this is good enough. We did it like this before. We'll just do this.
Oh
Versus
God,
to your point about willing
nothing I hate
happens
more
so
for
often.
reasoning. Nothing I hate more to hear from my team, the reasoning for something is, that's how we've done it in the past. Like that
Yes.
is one of my pet peeves. If when someone tells me that, it's like a red flag, just like bing, ding, 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 ding. Like it's funny because now that I sort of lead, I'm just gonna, like Mark Pincus story. Like Mark Pincus used to come into some of our meetings. Like we'd have these quarterly meetings, right? And we'd present
Yeah.
this like huge deck. And I can just remember him coming to this meeting sometimes, and he'd have his sort of like, I can remember one where he had his feet like on the table, and he's sort of like playing with his phone, and it's not really paying attention. Like we're literally giving the presentation thinking, oh, this is a breeze, right? We're just like going through it. I didn't even see him look up, right? And then someone said something just like what I'm saying that I said. And it was like the phone dropped, his eyes perked up, and it was like, oh, it's on. You know what I mean? Like someone said, because
Yeah.
that's how we do it, or that's how we've done it. And it was like, and I feel like that's a trigger for me now too. It's like I'll be skimming something or whatever, and I'll say something to something. I critique a lot. I'll throw out a lot of things like, what do you think about this? And I'll get back a ton of stuff. And generally, I'm just like, okay, 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 okay. But when I get back, well, that's how we've done it, I am so annoyed. And I just like, it's like I just dig right into it. It's like, okay, now you have my full attention. Now I'm going to tear this up. And I think it's the difference between doing what you're supposed to and thinking about it. And I just saw this example today. This is why this is so fresh, and why I'm going so into it. Is there was something that somebody was working on, and they basically were doing it correct. They did it correct, but they didn't stop and, like, to your point, the second layer, like, think about it. Well, it's correct in how we've defined it, but is it right? Like, is it right how you're saying it or how you're doing it currently? And whoever was working on it really, like I said, was kind of lazy. Like they didn't go beyond what was sort of defined within the organization. And I've sort of tried to really build an organization where it's like, yes, there's information, those are guidelines, those aren't rules. So don't blindly accept anything from them. You need to be thinking and using your brain and thinking, well, even though this is a guideline, is this the right thing for us to be doing right now?
Right.
So yeah, that's an important skill. Sorry,
Y-
it's like triggered me, JK.
Yeah, so I mean, I definitely agree with that. Like the difference between the number of people who do accept good enough versus trying to do things in the best way possible. I mean, definitely in the minority. And then I actually have a framework. I think I might have talked about it before, like a PM operating system. I call like the four
It's
P's
a great
operating
framework.
system. And one layer of that is personality. there are four aspects to personality that I have as part of that framework. The first aspect I call the bulldog and the cockroach, meaning like, you know, for PMs at my company, I tell them you have to be a bulldog, meaning, you have to be able to like talk to people directly and be very vocal about things that need to happen. But you also need to be a cockroach. In other words, like be very persistent, survive, continue to keep going after things. Uh, the second aspect of personality I call rebuking your neighbor, and this comes actually from a biblical verse from Leviticus, and I think I might have talked about this before in a previous podcast, but I think these biblical verses are so good. And by the way, I'm not even Christian, but I do study whether it's Christianity or the Vedanta, the ancient Hindu texts or Stoicism. I think there's just a lot of wisdom and a lot of ancient writing that's very relevant to our lives today. But Leviticus 19:17, rebuke your neighbor frankly, so you will not share in their guilt. And I think that verse is so powerful because it speaks to the fact that if you're a PM and you see something wrong, but you don't say anything, it's actually you're just at fault as a person making that mistake. And then a second verse I really love is Proverbs 27:6. Better are the wounds of a friend than the deceitful kisses of an enemy, meaning that the way that you should receive feedback is to understand that when somebody's giving you feedback, they're trying to help you, not hurt you. But in so many companies today, it's like people treat feedback as an attack rather than, hey, actually, here's something that could help me get better. And so those are two biblical verses I just like really like and contain, in my opinion, so much wisdom. But the second part of personality is about rebuking your neighbor. And I understand certain organizations, this is going to be challenging, but I think in the right organization, the ability to do this, in my opinion, it really helps um, move the needle and surfaces problems and gets things to a point where things become more actionable so that you can actually make a big impact on a product.
Can
The
I just
third,
jump in there?
oh yeah, please, please.
JK, I just because this one is, I think this one is really tough, and I think it's very much defined by the organization itself. So I
Yes.
feel like this is the
Yep.
one where you have to understand the organization. At Zynga, this was totally the culture, right? I mean, you could freaking say whatever you wanted to whomever you want. You would email Pincus an idea, he's going to respond to you, right? Uh, Meritocracy was one of our core principles, and it wasn't just something on the wall. At like two companies after Zynga that I went to that was outside of gaming, like not even close to a core value, right? Like telling
Right.
somebody something that was going to hurt their feelings was the worst thing that you could do. Even if it say, I was going to save the company close to 3% of our profit margins with an
Yeah.
idea that I had. We're going to cut back on something ridiculous that we were buying for all of our, like, for all these people. Literally the worst thing I could have done. Like, because I offended the head of marketing, and that was something that he really liked, and the way I said it wasn't right, and all that bullshit that people get into
Right.
to avoid the reality that they may want to consider not doing this because they're going to save the company money, right? So that one is definitely, I feel like, unfortunately, cultural driven. So you gotta kind of be a chameleon on that one and kind of just do how the
Right.
culture does it.
And,
Although we've
and
talked about
actually
whether or
tying
not
that
that's
back,
good.
right. And tying that back to organizational structure, generally speaking, the more mature, stable one to end type of companies, you generally see that type of culture. Not in every company, like you said, Zynga, it wasn't like that, but usually the 0 to 1 companies where you're potentially facing an existential threat, unless you fix things, generally speaking, it's better to have this kind of rebuking your neighbor type of communication. And the third personality aspect that I often that's part of this framework is communications. So just the ability to communicate well and with people. And I do realize that this is very, very difficult. Like even the notion of rebuking your neighbor, even the notion of just like communicating really well and understanding the difference between like not only verbal communication, but understanding when to use verbal communication, when to use written communication, and how best to communicate things verbally, written, when to document things. The managing the communication, understanding the communication flow between different groups. This kind of larger aspect of communication is something that PMs need to think about, but generally, in my opinion, don't do enough. And so that would be the third aspect of personality. And finally, the one that I see as probably the biggest issue, or this issue that I see the most often, is follow through, right? And I know we've talked about this before, Brett, but it's like the PM designs a process, or somebody designs a process, emails everybody, and then it's everybody else's fault when the process isn't followed, right? I've seen this like so many times. And so um, I actually created did I show this to you, the biblical quote that I came up with?
Yeah, I think you showed it to me. It was part of the UC the USC
Yes.
presentation or
Okay.
something like
So
that. Yeah.
yeah, as part of this talk, so Matthew 18:21 through 22. Then Peter came up and said to him, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? As many as 7 times? Jesus said to him, I do not say to you 7 times, but 70 times seven. And then just as like a PM analog, something I talked to some of the PMs at my company, I have a kind of analogous quote where I wrote, then the PM came up and said to me, bro, how often shall my coworker not follow my process and I need to talk to him? As many as 7 times? And I said to him, I do not say to you 7 times, but 70 times seven. So the point being, and this is kind of a joke, but the point being that like, so many PMs do not understand, especially junior PMs, that you can't just design a process, throw it out there in an email, and expect everyone to like just adopt the process, right? It really, like, the install of the process is 10 times, 100 times more difficult than the design of the process. And the other thing to realize is sometimes even the perfect process by theory, if you can create a process that may not be as efficient, but is a lot simpler and more likely to be adopted, might be the better process, because on the execution and follow through side, there'll be a higher likelihood for the better process to be implemented. And so the personality part is going back to the bulldog and the cockroach in terms of follow through. Do you have the personality to just keep at it, keep talking to these people, keep raising this issue with people about installing a new process that needs to be adopted? And again, this is something that I see time and time and time again, where it isn't so much about knowing what to do, but personality is really the effectiveness driver, right? It's not just about what to do, but like how effective are you able to make the initiatives that are designed that may be the right thing, but because you don't have the right personality, it doesn't get pushed through. It doesn't become effective, even though it might be exactly the right thing.
Yeah, and I don't know if this fits exactly with it, but this is where my mind went when you were talking about
Mhm.
follow through, which is an ability to do the uncomfortable. And I feel like that is something I've been able to overcome, I think, through playing sports or whatever it is in my childhood. I kind of moved around a lot, but I feel like a lot of PMs like to sit behind their computer. And that's what you're talking about. What they send out the process,
Yeah.
and then they think everyone's just robots and they're going to follow it. And I think what I learned early on from a great manager of mine, Justin Wickett, when I emailed the central team to send out emails, he's like, no, 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 get up, cross the street. This is when we had like different buildings. Go over there, walk into their office, and ask them to send out the email. And I was like, really? Really? He's like, yeah, that's what you got to do. And you got to do it every day for the next, till they do it. And that was sort of like the uncomfortableness that I had to overcome to get my email out or get my email campaign out. And I think that served me well over a lot of different things. Like when features are getting out, I would just sit over by the QA like group and just sit there, and it's sort of like this follow through kind of comes with just that uncomfortable uncomfortableness you got to overcome to get things to get out the door. That makes good PMs. It's not just writing the spec. It's like getting the feedback, having 20 people tell you it's crap, going back and being okay with it. It's like there's just this level of basically uncomfortableness that you just want to be okay with. Be comfortable with the uncomfortable. It's really how I would put it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a famous anecdotal story from Apple and Tim Cook in a meeting that's kind of similar to your story, but instead of cross the street, it's go to China, where basically there's a story that Tim Cook was in a meeting where I think there was some kind of like supply chain issue with one of the vendors in China. And so this guy was talking about these problems that needs to be addressed. And then Tim basically looks at him and he's like, well, what are you doing? Why are you still here? And he basically goes straight to the airport and flies to China without packing to address this issue. And that's part of this personality thing, right? It's like you see a problem, do you have the personality to just address it, do whatever it takes to take care of it, like right then and right there? Or to your point, Brett, do you like sit behind the desk and like, yeah, this is what we should be doing? Let me answer my emails now. So that's the big difference. And maybe we
Yeah,
could
I
now
think
talk.
I think
Oh,
it's
go ahead.
Genshi Gen Butsu, which is for the Toyota way. People, I'm a big Toyota production system, which is go and see for yourself. It's kind of one of the
Okay.
principles of the Toyota way. So, kind of go down to the factory floor and see what the issue is yourself, right? See with your own eyes what's
Right.
going on. Similar to sort of if you're going to execute a process, like go execute it yourself, right? Like go with your own eyes and see it.
Yeah, and maybe for some of the PMs out there, I thought we could kind of end the conversation today by talking about prioritization or like for some of these skills or personality traits, what do we think would be the most important if we're giving advice to different folks about how to prioritize what skills or what personality traits to potentially adopt? And we could also talk about, do people even have the ability to change their personality traits? But I think that in my experience, one of the debates that I often have, well, not often, but every once in a while I'll have with like folks when I talk about this topic about, what's important for a PM. Generally speaking, I think that especially at like bigger companies that come from like an HD background, usually what I hear is that, quantitative skills are the most important. And there does seem to be, when you look at to your point about recruiting and how you test for a PM, that there is a strong focus on analytical and quantitative skills and not so much on personality. In I guess where it sounds like we're kind of agreeing on this aspect, which is that at least it seems like you and I are agreeing that personality, these issues that we talked about when it comes to communication, rebuking your neighbor, follow through, things like that, these might actually be the more difficult things to be able to train or develop in a person. So maybe you should be testing for these things instead of, quantitative skills or other things like that. Would you agree, Brett?
Yeah, completely. But that requires someone to think creatively and of a hiring process that tries to answer these questions, which is much harder than are you analytical? Are you analytical is pretty easy,
Yeah,
right? Do a regression analysis, like do this, do that, right? So,
right.
much harder to find
Because I think it's
personality
even hard to
traits.
test for. It's like, I mean, I've asked questions as well. Like, here's a problem between, you know, um, here's a problem that you see, or here's, there's a conflict between design and PM. What do you do? And then, yeah, of course, people are like, oh yeah, I step in immediately and I talk to these people. It's like, okay, but then, in practice, does that actually happen? Like, so I'm not sure how you could actually test for, a personality trait where in a written test, you might say, yes, I immediately, intervene. Or like, you could say, you see someone being harassed at work. What do you
I am
do? I
super
step in
disciplined.
between them and yeah, so
Give
I think
me,
that's the hard part is like, how do you actually test for some of this stuff?
yeah.
But
I mean, Totally. I mean, I think you have to be pretty laser focused about what personality traits you want to find out about, and then it's hard, but I think you can do it. I mean, ours, for example, one of ours is diligence, right? And you can kind of test with that, or thinking, and you can see how
Yeah.
well, you can do little things like we don't give a lot of direction in our interviews, for example, and it's a little Willy
Okay.
Wonka-ish, but it's on purpose because we want people to be able to go Google it or ask the right questions or figure it out on their own. And it's funny because a lot of people will be like, "Well, you didn't give me enough direction." It's like exactly that was on
Right.
purpose. We don't want to be giving people direction all the time,
Yeah.
right? Like we want people to be able to get like
Yeah.
85% of it and go, well, let me Google that, let me think about that, or come with a suggestion of improving it. Those are the best kind. They'll be like, I saw your interview outline and I corrected a few things. I thought this might be a better way to do it. You're like, wow, okay, that person's going the extra mile. So you can kind of see those things, but it is hard. I mean, the hiring process is just inaccurate.
Yeah.
It's very difficult. Yeah.
Right. And I,
Um,
I think to your point on change, I do think that even speaking for myself, like there are a lot of things I would rather not do, a lot of conversations I would rather not have. So it does help. I think we've talked about this before as well. Like when you are in a situation where you're a startup with limited funds, things like that, then that does often help to have those hard conversations, and it kind of forces change because you have to or you die. But and so then I would say, like, are there ways in the company, if you are trying to create changes, where you could create incentive systems or other systems that force change? I know, Tesla, Elon Musk is pretty famous for, do this by tomorrow or you're fired or something like that. Then it's like, oh yeah, well, I guess he's going to do it.
Does he fall through?
Um,
They don't get it done. Yeah. Well, I mean, it just depends on you can get anything done. It's just the quality of it. But yeah, I mean, to your point on like what is most important, I guess, in terms of the original question, I'm gonna do the cheesy answer, but I think it just kind of depends on what your goals are, which is such a cheesy way to say stuff, but I really do think it applies here because and you might be saying, well, I don't know. And I think the best way to figure out your goals is to extend it to perfect. Okay. So just go extreme on it, right? Like think of your perfect scenario. If your perfect scenario is be the CEO of EA, right? A big public company, then quant is probably not the thing you want to double down on, right? Like people skills,
yeah.
um, collaboration, buy-in, all that stuff is probably more important, right? If you want to be the next like creator of the next great gaming company, then like I don't know how important quants because some quant skills are going to be important, but it's probably going to be creativity, get understanding how the player, figuring out a market, like much more game designy, right? And maybe organizational design, like under and get a good base of people. Like it's all gonna kind of depend on what you want to do, right? Like for me, I didn't really ever want to be the CEO of a public company. So I can remember when I got to director or product level and they were like, well, we really want you to build a rapport in the organization. We want you to go talk to other director of products. We want you to get to known as like a leader. And I just remember thinking to myself, like, this is none of these skills are skills that I really care for, right? And if I don't care for them, I'm not going to do them well. It's just not. It's not a muscle that I really want to strengthen. It's just not. It's not where I see myself going. And that's when I kind of left. And that was one of the reasons. It's just like this isn't something like I want to be a product manager, product designer, like PM, creating stuff that makes money, like on the ground. Like I want to be like a like a high level leader of a small troop of soldiers. You know what I mean? Right now, at least.
Right.
Um, so that kind of depends. And I mean, I think the other thing that we talked about because it's philosophers, it's like, well, the organization really values this, and it's like, well, again, what's best for you in the long run? Is it to just like focus on what the organization wants, or to really kind of focus on yourself? Because if it's not ultimately in your long-term vision, then you might want to think about changing. So um, I would err on the side of going with personal preference over or personal goals over like the organization really wants me to be like political, And honestly, it can be to
Right.
your detriment. I mean, one of the last point on that is like one of the reasons why I did leave and start my company at the point that I did. And I'm interested to your thoughts on this, JK, is like once you get to a certain point in your career, the opportunity cost becomes very large, right? I mean, in
Right.
your wife, your kids, your lifestyle, like everything goes to that level. And so if you get too kind of high up in the org, you very rarely see VPs or high level execs going to start companies because they're already making a ton of money, right? So it's and then they have to sustain that lifestyle pretty much unless they've, just they've been really good at discipline about not increasing their costs. And so for them to go break off and then go start a new thing and kind of like forego all those luxuries that they've become accustomed to is very difficult, right? And so that was kind of like my
Right.
thought process too. I had sort of hit that lead product manager, director of product level, and I realized like, if I go higher, man, that's going to be really hard for me to have that conversation with my wife, right? It's really hard for me to like change my lifestyle or my income level once you get to that level. And so that's where, going back to my original point, is like you have to be kind of careful about what you kind of buy into because there's unintended consequences of it. I see this all the time with all my finance buddies, right? Or my consulting buddies, like, oh, I'll just do it for 2 years. Well, 10, 15 years later, they're still doing consulting. They hate it. Yeah, they make like good money, but they've just spent 15 years of their life doing something they hate, right? And now they're kind of
Right.
stuck because they're making $1 million a year or whatever they're making. And it's not like they're going to go tell their wife, like, hey, honey, now we're going to make $150,000 because I want to like, trace my dream. I mean, some do. I'm not saying people don't. It just becomes a lot harder to do that.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I do think as philosophers, I think you raise a really important point about knowing what your ultimate objective is and optimizing for that as well. And so I would almost kind of uh, probably put it into two steps, right? Which is like exactly everything that you talked about, thinking about your long term objective and what gets you there in terms of skills and personality. But then in terms of the current organization, and we've talked about, I know that we've talked about how Zynga has some notion of a skills development matrix. At my company, we have something that I've developed called a skills development matrix that basically highlights the skills and like the personality traits that will allow you to be successful for different stages of role, like PM, senior PM, lead PM, director PM, whatever, at our company. And then I would say the prioritization exercise with that and how that's useful is like you can look at all of that and then you try to determine where what you're strong at, where you're not strong at, and then for you to be able to do well at your job, how do you prioritize in a sequential way? And so you just use a stacked list the things that you should be working on to be able to better develop your skills and whether it's hard skills like quant skills or even like personality and communication skills, things like that. And but to your point, I think that's the thing that you do at your current organization to show you how you can be as effective as possible at your current organization. But then when you look at that, and then to your point, does that fit with your longer term strategy and your ultimate objective or not? And then if it doesn't, then maybe you should rethink whether the organization you're at is the right place or not.
Oh,
But
yeah. Yeah. And I think the last thing I would say about it is don't discount or listen to your emotions. I've told you I've been sort of on an emotional kick, but when I look back at my product management career, I would I would gravitate towards things that I liked, and I think that was a good thing. And I would solve things that I didn't like, and that was also really valuable to me at Zynga and other places as well. It's like I feel like a lot of people won't listen to what they don't like, or they just bitch about it. And one thing that created a lot of value for me is like I would get frustrated about things, but then I would just dedicate 1 quarter to fixing that thing. And I think that's the same in kind of self improvement, right? Like I feel like if you listen to like stuff that you hate, sometimes that can be a bigger motivator, right? For example, I started my own company more so I could avoid the shit I hated at working at crappy companies than I ever did to buy a Ferrari. right? Like there's no Ferrari on the wall. Like someday I'm going to buy a Ferrari, but there is the thought of never having a shitty manager again who fucking bullshits you and is dumb as shit and just fucking sits around, has meetings all day. You know, like that's more on my wall. Like never have to deal with this person again than someday I'm going to have a Ferrari. I could, you know, I mean, but that's just me. And I think it though, in general, it's
Right.
like the avoidance of terrible things can be a much better motivator than the desire for better. If that makes sense. Yeah.
All
Excited.
right.
Go
Well,
get
there
it.
you have
Go
it.
become.
I think
Go be a PM.
we're both
Go start all over
agreeing.
again. Go start.
But yeah, I
Go
think we're
start all
both
over again.
agreeing that personality is probably harder than skills. Although, I mean, but I also think that from my perspective, I've generally worked with people that have like, strong engineering backgrounds or other quantitative backgrounds. So maybe I haven't dealt with enough people who don't have that background where I just haven't run into that kind of a situation before. But hopefully that doesn't bite me in the ass. But yeah, it does seem like for me, in my experience, a lot of times it's been more personality issues than skills. But if any of you guys have different thoughts, please let us know, and feel free to let us know in comments or emails or whatever. But I don't know. I think that's all we got. Unless you've got any final thoughts, Brett.
Yeah, it's good to be back.
All right, there it is. Yeah, we should keep this rolling. There you have it. PM skills versus personality. And until next time, everybody, we'll catch you next time. Bye.